So hi, my name's Joe Brewer, and in this presentation, I want to share with you a powerful framework that can be used to help think about large-scale social change efforts. And that is the framework of cultural scaffolding. And we're going to discuss this in the context of the efforts that are needed to make the transition to global sustainability. Now, first off, to really get a sense of what I mean by scaffolding, we're all familiar with the use of scaffolding in construction, where the basic frame of a building isn't yet able to support itself, and so the scaffolding is set up to help the construction workers to build the basic supports that then enable the building to stand on its own. And the scaffolding at that point can be removed. So you can think of scaffolding as something that supports a developmental process, but that doesn't necessarily need to continue to function or serve an active role at a later stage in the development. Now, when we think about this in the context of culture, it's really helpful to think of scaffolding in the way that we raise children. So just reflect for a moment on how much support is needed to take someone from being a newborn all the way through adolescence, where they have a supportive environment where there are people who give them objects to play with, that teach them basic skills and knowledge, and over time they build on these things to be able to develop as a person. So in the same way that all of this scaffolding is provided to raise a child into early adulthood, we can think about larger cultural patterns as building upon a number of supports as a process develops and changes that are vital to the future possibilities or future capabilities that that culture is eventually going to have. Now, before we go into cultural scaffolding in detail, I want to take a brief detour into the world of thermodynamics and talk about entropy. Now, entropy is the measure of disorder within a system. So as you can see with these well-organized horizontal and vertical rows of dots in the left, the low entropy picture, that in this kind of a system that has that kind of uniformity, it doesn't require very much information to describe everything that's going on. Whereas the same number of dots in the right-hand picture, where it says high entropy, requires more information to reproduce that pattern. And so there's a higher level of information that's involved. So sometimes this is called having more disorder in the system, but you could also think of it as how much information does it take to characterize it. Now the image on the bottom is a fractal called the Sierpinski triangle. And what I want you to see is that as you go through the steps of removing pieces from the triangle in a very specific way, the amount of entropy goes up. So there's a way of thinking about patterns that simply by playing out the pattern, you can increase the amount of disorder or the amount of structure in a system. Well, we can think in the same way about how culture can have increasing structure over time as it's increasing its entropy. And the key thing is that there's the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in any kind of energy exchange, entropy can never reduce. So this is a physical limit on our ability to organize information, that anytime we do work on a system, we either keep the amount of information the same or we increase it, but we can't reduce it. So that means that the scaffolding process for energy exchanges in thermodynamics is always one that's leading toward greater empathy over time, or greater entropy over time. And a simple way to think about this is if you were to take this wine glass, this goblet, and shatter it, as you can see that as time goes on, as it's breaking down, its energy is being used up as it breaks, but you would have to do a lot of work and add energy in very specific ways to move these broken pieces back together and reproduce the original goblet. And this in thermodynamics is called irreversibility. And a process where entropy increases is also one that is irreversible, which means that it doesn't spontaneously go back to the pattern that existed before. But instead, work has to be done. And in some cases, it's, in practical terms, impossible to do the work to return to the original state. So you can think of this process of going irreversibly from one organization of a system to some higher level disorder or higher entropy state of a system as being something that is irreversible, is that's a constraint on how patterns form in nature in general. So when we look at something like this mold that is forming in a petri dish, you can see that in the beginning there's very little structure, and then as it grows it creates new structures as it goes along, as it's radiating outward. And this is not violating the laws of thermodynamics. Actually, we can see that the amount of organizational structure is increasing over time. But also we can see that the patterns that were there before are setting constraints for what can come later. And this is something we can see really well if we look at how a snowflake grows. So here is an ice crystal, or what we would call a snowflake in normal everyday language. You can see how as the ice crystal is forming, that the structures that existed before set constraints on what kinds of structures can emerge later. So you can think of the existing structures of this ice crystal as being like a scaffolding on which new structures grow. And in the same way that this ice crystal can only grow in certain ways without violating the laws of thermodynamics, cultural scaffolding can only develop in certain ways without violating the laws of physics, but also some of the laws of cultural evolution that we'll discuss a little bit later on. Now, these constraints on how patterns form can be quite complex, as you can see here with these mushrooms, that in living systems and biology, the constraints on development can be quite complex. So the scaffolding for earlier structures in the development of an organism's body can create very elaborate structures later on. So the scaffolding process can be destructive, the way that we saw with the broken wine glass, or it can be highly generative and create very detailed and intricate structures. Now, the way that I'm going to be talking about cultural scaffolding for the rest of this presentation is informed by this paper written by William Wimsatt and James Griesemer, where they talk in great detail about how an entrenchment process leads to the kinds of scaffolded structures in culture. So if you want to learn more about this than I'm going to talk about here, I recommend going and getting a copy of this paper. So here's how they describe what cultural scaffolding is. They say that cultural scaffolding is the generative interactions between actors, artifacts, practices, and infrastructure so that culture is able to build upon itself. And I've included here an image of a teacher who is teaching a student how to do mathematics. And you can see that there are two actors in this scene. There's the teacher and the student. They're using artifacts, in this case the chalk and the blackboard and the classroom that they're in, and that they're engaging in different kind of pedagogical practices to teach the child how to do mathematics, in this case learning basic arithmetic. And that there's a larger set of infrastructure in the curriculum of the entire school and larger shared knowledge in the culture, say the same language that they both speak, and the infrastructure of the classroom or the school system. So the ability to learn something like mathematics requires these interactions between the actors performing different tasks, the artifacts that they use, the practices that they're using to engage in activities with the artifacts, and the structures of their social environment. In the same way, we could see how a parent who's teaching their child how to walk is providing scaffolding every step of the way as the child's brain and body develops. Or in a more complex setting, like learning how to do ballet, there is a whole set of structured practices where the teacher will use different artifacts, like the bar that's on the wall that the students will put their feet up on and do stretches and movements. And so there's quite a lot of complexity that can arise between the generative interactions of cultural scaffolding. And of course, in the final picture, we have two people working in a chemistry lab where you can imagine how many years of cultural scaffolding or formal education are needed in different laboratory settings to learn how to be an active professional chemist. So in every one of these cases, the cultural scaffolding is quite complex, and it can last anywhere from weeks through many years of development across a person's lifespan. So now returning to this idea of cultural scaffolding as a development process that we can see really well for how children grow up from newborns to adults, that we can also see things like after a certain period of time, there may be scaffolding that's already put in place, certain structures, so that other structures are much more difficult to learn. And a popular example is learning languages. There's a well-known phenomenon that parts of the brain develop the capacity to learn language very well, but at a very early age. And then later in life, it takes much more effort to learn the language than it would have earlier on. So we can think of there being physical scaffolding in the structures of the brain itself that might hinder or help how the cultural scaffolding process works for the ability to learn new practices. Similarly, if we think of something like differential calculus or other kinds of advanced mathematics, where it may require learning more elementary forms of mathematics so that the concepts and the language and the skills are present for doing more advanced mathematics, that we can think of there being sequencing for some cultural scaffolding processes that are necessary to learn some things earlier before other things can be learned later on. So there might be developmental constraints in terms of sequencing, as well as having critical periods of development where it's easier or more difficult to put scaffolding in place. And now there are other kinds of experiences in our lives where we can see how this cultural scaffolding process works. For example, if you've already taken a pathway in your life where you got a degree and now have a career, but you want to go back and get another degree and learn knowledge that you could apply to change careers, that this is something that takes time and effort. So we can't simply add any cultural scaffolding that we want, but sometimes the ways that we've chosen how our lives unfold, or just the way our lives have developed without us having any say in it, may cut off the ability to do certain things so that it's more effortful or it's disruptive to what we're doing to make big changes. Similarly, we might be financially or legally locked into obligations, such as if you take out a mortgage on a house and you owe money and it's difficult to move without selling the home, that basically you have created a kind of entrenchment for yourself where it's much more difficult to make big changes in your life without addressing this debt or this owned piece of property that's now a part of your life. And of course, with the example of starting a family, you can see how there's an irreversibility to the kinds of choices and priorities that people have before having children versus after having children. So all of these are aspects of how cultural scaffolding works, where large changes may be disruptive and be effortful later in life, or that we may lock ourselves into pathways where it's very difficult to change and do something quite different because the constraints of our choices have set us into a path that makes development away from that path more difficult. So all of this is about how that cultural scaffolding constrains what can develop in the future. So not only is this true for people's lives, it's also true for the development of technology. So if you think about, as this graphic shows, the way that technology builds on itself, such as how the designs of automobiles can build on previous designs that came before, where there may have been weaknesses in the design, where it was a vehicle that was unsafe to drive, so they made modifications to make it more safe, or they may have had new breakthrough innovations in materials that create more lightweight metal alloys, for example. Or there might be new tools and technologies for designing the automotive engineering design features of the cars. But there's a developmental pathway through which previous designs create optimal paths for developing new designs, so that through a process of iteration, you can have considerable improvements in the technology over time. And this whole complex process depends on cultural scaffolding every step of the way. For example, you have people who serve different roles as they develop and design or manufacture and distribute these automobiles, such as the line worker doing some welding in this picture here. And there's also quite a lot of artifacts and infrastructure that are used to inform how automotive engineering is done. So there might be robotic automation in factories. There could be the use of sketches or digital drafting work, creating blueprints. But in either case, this process of creating generative interactions between the people, the artifacts, the practices, and the infrastructure is how the technology develops over time. And at an even larger level, as we design and develop our technologies, such as the use of the automobile, we have other kinds of interacting structures and systems that scaffold the development as well. such as transitioning from the horse and buggy to paved roads and highways for automobiles, which creates unintended consequences like traffic congestion. Or it changes the way that we use the land so that we dedicate more of the land surface to automobile transport, to moving around of the machines, rather than some alternative use of the land, such as maintaining pristine forests, or if we're using it as agriculture. And you can really see this development process in this set of images, which shows how the structures of the land for the location of Disneyland changed over time as it built up and became more complex. So just as we saw with the mushroom that was growing earlier in that animation that we talked about briefly a few minutes ago, you can see how there can be very complex and intricate structures that arise through this cultural scaffolding process. So that over time you can have an entire city that is filled with different relationships between people, structures, and artifacts that shape what kinds of decisions they can make in the future. So cultural scaffolding greatly limits the developments that can happen in the future, but also allows for quite sophisticated, complicated, and nuanced developments to build upon what did come before. Now let's take a step back and think about this very simply using a mental image. And this image comes from developmental biology for the way that a fertilized egg will develop through childhood through adulthood stages for any living organism. Where the marble at the top of the scene, as it rolls down, as it rolls downhill, it falls into one path or another. And as it goes into different paths, the way that the landscape is laid out, it's meant to show that if you want to move from one channel to another, you have to do work on the ball. In this case, pushing it back up the hill or pushing it over a hill sideways. And this is meant to be a visual metaphor for how developmental choices will lock us into some pathways of development and not others. And we've already seen several examples of that in the way that we talked about childhood development and learning language, or developing complex skills like advanced mathematics, or also in the design of technology over time, that there's a kind of lock-in that happens where the work has to be done to change paths. And you can already see the implications of this for thinking about the global ecological crisis, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, here's an example where we can start to see that the generative interactions can be quite dynamic. So here we have a scene where the structures of the landscape, the shape of the road and where the entrances and exits are, allow for constraints that create the patterns of traffic flow. So just as the structures help shape what the patterns are in real time for the movement of traffic, you can see that cultural scaffolding can be quite dynamic from moment to moment. And if we go up a level higher, we can see for an entire city that there are tremendous constraints in an urban landscape like this one on where traffic can flow, which ways it can flow, and at what speeds it can flow. So the scaffolding for social environments in today's world can be very entrenched and can be multifaceted and lead to very complex multiple level structures like a 21st century urban landscape. So now I just want you to think for a moment, as you look at images like this one of London, just how much cultural scaffolding has developed throughout the 4,000-year history of the city, creating a place that is going to be very limited in how it can change. It is already very much on a pathway with inertia and irreversibility in all of its embedded structures. So what would be involved in the cultural scaffolding process to move away from this kind of infrastructure to something different? The same thing could be said about large-scale agriculture, where if you fly over most parts of the United States or Western Europe, or really just about any part of the world that's not too high in the latitudes, you'll see that the land looks like this, where most of the ground cover has been converted for human uses to use as agriculture. We've already transformed the kinds of landscapes, the kind of forest ecosystems or grassland ecosystems that have been turned into agriculture. How much entrenchment and how much cultural scaffolding in the history that led to this condition limits our ability to make changes on a large scale. And you can also see it another way by looking at a timestamp where if you see the same location in two different times, here we have a city in China, where over the period of 30 years, the landscape has changed dramatically as urbanization has set in. So the human population has been growing, and this city went from being very sparsely populated to very densely populated. And there's a trajectory of scaffolding and development that has caused this. And so to think of dealing with large-scale social problems like, say, global warming, where we need to move away from fossil fuel infrastructure, we can start to think about how these large-scale developmental processes and the various kinds of cultural scaffolding involved limit our ability to make substantial changes. So this leads to a profound and somewhat disturbing question. Are we already locked into an unsustainable future? What are the limitations of the current lock-in or entrenchment of our social infrastructure? Are we teaching things to children as they grow up so that they have the skills and knowledge and the practices that they need to help make a transition to the sustainable world? And would they be able to survive through disruptions if we're not able to? Also, are we able to change things like the infrastructure for transportation and energy or agriculture when so much entrenchment has already happened? These are really important questions, and a good place to start really unpacking them is with a really seemingly simple question. How much can still be changed? So just as we saw with the development process across the lifespan for a human being, and we saw across those changing landscapes of cities and countrysides, that some of the changes are so deeply entrenched that they'd be very difficult to reverse. But there are some things that can be changed. So a key question for us as you ponder what this cultural scaffolding approach to thinking about cultural change suggests is that there are going to be a lot of things that can't be changed, or things that can be changed will require work and effort to move away from one developmental pathway to another, and that can be quite difficult and time-consuming to do. So how much can still be changed needs to be answered in two ways. One is, what can be changed at all? Is it even possible to make a change of a particular kind? And another thing is, on the timescales that we have to address different problems, can we make the changes that are needed in the time for those problems to be addressed? This is particularly crucial for global warming, where we need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and dramatically change our land use practices and energy infrastructure in a time frame that keeps us safe from runaway global warming. So there are timescales that we need to think about for those large-scale problems. One way to begin to reflect on what can be changed is to reflect on what has already changed. And I'm showing you this image of Africa where you can see in a very large and dramatic impression from the top of the image that the Sahara Desert is absolutely huge. This desert covers about a third of the largest landmass on Earth. It's gigantic. It's almost inconceivable how big it is. But what most people don't know is that the Sahara Desert has only been a desert for 5,000 or 6,000 years. That during the last kind of halfway between the time of the last ice age and the present day, we've had a massive change in the land use of the African continent that has happened in conjunction with changes in planetary climate to create the largest desert on Earth. So one thing that you can think about here is that the time frame that it took to turn this lush green landscape into that giant desert was several thousand years. So to try to reverse that and make that giant desert lush and green again, while it may not take several thousand years, it certainly can't be done over a period of 3 or 4 years. So you can begin to think about global scale processes setting their own constraints on what can and can't be done in a given time frame. Now I want to share another way of thinking about cultural scaffolding that really was not presented originally as cultural scaffolding, but in the context of thinking about these developmental processes that limit the patterns that can emerge in the future. Just glance at the different graphs that I'm showing now, and some of them may be difficult to read because they're small, but every one of these graphs is showing a time frame of the industrial era from 1750 to the present day, where you can see there have been massive changes in things like the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, or the amount of foreign direct investment in fossil fuels, or the growth of the human population. And you can see a rise in the occurrence rate of great floods, or that you can see there being a shrinking of global biodiversity as an extinction event is taking place. A mass extinction event is beginning to happen. What all of these graphs indicate in their own ways is that there's a huge amount of momentum in our globalized economic system, and that it's built up over a period of several hundred years. So the cultural scaffolding that has put us on a pathway toward ecological collapse is huge and very substantial. So this calls into question the possibility of making a transition to sustainability. So now we can ask a question like this, which future will we guide ourselves toward as a species? And what I hope you are really feeling at this point in the presentation is that we're limited in the kinds of changes we can make for our future. So part of our future that we will guide ourselves is the future we've already been guiding ourselves toward for several hundred years, because the cultural scaffolding throughout that time gave rise to the explosion of human population and the acceleration of technology and the use of energy, especially fossil fuels. So during the last 250 years, we have seen a considerable amount of pathway constraint that tells us quite a lot about what pathway we are now on. So we've already been guiding ourselves toward a future that we may not have been aware of. So part of answering this question is to understand what those constraints are. But another part is to ask what can still be changed and what kind of future do we want? And this is a challenge for what I call culture design, which is the scientific approach to intentional change at large scales. So this concept of cultural scaffolding comes from the study of cultural evolution, which is basically to take an approach similar to how Charles Darwin thought about changes in species in biology and this idea of natural selection, that there is an analogous way of thinking about culture where it's an evolutionary process where there's a variety of different cultural traits at any given time. And some of those traits, some of those behaviors, ideas, practices, etc., are more adapted to their environments than others. And so the better we understand how evolution informs cultural adaptiveness, the better we can apply cultural scaffolding processes to social change efforts. And so if we are going to try to make the change from our current trajectory to one that gets us to planetary sustainability, we will have to use culture design to do it. And so right now, we hold in our hands the future of our entire world. And so as you think about what I've said here in this presentation, that cultural scaffolding is a set of generative interactions between actors, artifacts, practices, and infrastructure, that the patterns are constrained in ways that we really need to understand very well. So as we consider our future together in this period of time where disruptions are quite huge and the future is not looking that positive for us, we really need to take seriously this cultural scaffolding process. And I want you to know that I take it very seriously. This is a picture of my 10-month-old daughter, Elise. And I am very thoughtfully trying, along with my wife, we are both very thoughtfully trying to develop the cultural scaffolding we feel she will need in our parenting philosophies so that we can help her to thrive as an adult in the middle of the 21st century. And so just as we are taking great care to raise our child, we feel that there's need for our societies to take great care to create the scaffolding that will create resilience and thriving for entire communities and regions of people. So as I think about the future, I think of my daughter at some point being an adult, and she's going to see a world in front of her that we helped create. So this idea of cultural scaffolding is also very interesting in that it's ultimately up to us to choose what kinds of developmental pathways we want for the future of humanity and life on Earth. And the future that we are choosing today in our actions and our collective decisions are going to create the world that our children will experience tomorrow as adults. And so with that in mind, I really hope to leave with you a sense of responsibility that cultural scaffolding is not just something that you can let happen accidentally or be controlled by someone else who's taking the world toward a place that you don't feel is right for your children. That it's up to all of us to create the cultural scaffolding that we'll need to get there. With that in mind, I just say, let's get to work. We have a lot of culture design that we need to do to build the scaffolding for our future. Onward, fellow humans.